Okay, should I just start the talk or
Yes, sir.
okay, so let me share my screen. Um, so it looks like a small audience, so maybe we can just have a conversation or something um
Sir, actually today it's Independence Day, so we have a holiday, so I'm expecting less audience today.
oh right. I see. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Um
Actually, we are streaming live on YouTube also, so
okay.
there might be people on YouTube.
Okay.
So you can start your talk.
Sounds good. So do you see my screen? Did you see
Yes,
my
sir.
talk?
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
great. So well, thanks for coming on on Independence Day. Um, so yeah, I was going to talk about some work we've been doing on sort of the science of intelligence. So if you think about like the evolution and the building of intelligence, it's quite remarkable. About 500 million years ago is when the last common ancestor of all vertebrates lived. This is a lamprey. It's close to that. And in about 500 million years, the human brain evolved, and in the course of 500 years, from around Newton's time to Einstein's time, we developed quantum mechanics, general relativity, and so on. And then in the last decade, we had huge advances in artificial intelligence, right? So it's a pretty amazing sort of sequence of events that led to intelligence on our planet, both biological and artificial. And so we'd like to have a deeper scientific understanding of how all this works, right? So we've been sort of combining physics, math, neuroscience, psychology, CS to try to come up with theories of intelligence across both biological and artificial domains. So I'll tell you kind of five kind of areas in which AI can improve and where we might still be able to learn something from biology. So I'll talk about sort of data efficiency, energy efficiency, going beyond evolution to create new types of machines, say using quantum mechanics, explainable AI, and melding minds and machines. And I'll talk also about creativity and reasoning at the very end as well. So data efficiency. So if we think about, major order of magnitude discrepancy between brains and machines is how data hungry AI systems are, right? So you can imagine this box the area of this box is representing the number of tokens we train LLMs on, pre-train LLMs on. And it used to be 1 trillion, now it's gone up to like 10 trillion or so for the frontier models. How many words do we get? We get 100 million words. That's typically what an adult is exposed to. Um, and our DNA, if you translate it into words, is about 600 million words. So in terms of the combination of information we get from nature in terms of our DNA and nurture in terms of our experience is tiny compared to what LLMs get. If we were to read 10 trillion tokens, it would take us 240,000 years to do that. Okay, so AI is much more data hungry than we are. So we've done some, so how can we fix that? Here's one example work that we did. So you probably all encountered these. Oh, and by the way, it's a small audience, so feel free to like interrupt and ask questions and stuff like that. So,
So, Professor Kamli, may
so
I ask a question right now?
yeah, sure.
One another difference which I felt has not been discussed enough in the community, and I wanted your thoughts on that was our average response time and the human response time, for example, is around zero point 0.1 seconds.
Yeah,
Um, and the rate at which these machines process data is something like gigahertz usually, 10
yeah.
power minus 9 seconds. So how important is this difference? Is that indicative of some architectural or underlying? Is it indicating some basic difference between the two systems, or we still work with this hypothesis that these two systems are very similar otherwise?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, that's related to energy differences as well. I'll talk about energy next. I think the slowness and the energy efficiency go hand in hand to some extent. Um, and there's nothing like once we understand the principles of real competition in biological systems, there's nothing stopping us from increasing the clock speed, right? But biology may have been limited by certain clock speeds set by their energy budget. Um, So
Mhm.
after I cover the energy section, if you still have a question,
Mhm.
maybe raise it again. But that's a really
Okay.
good question.
Thank you.
Okay. Um, so yeah, so one of the dominant things that's happened over the last decade is scaling, right? So we've scaled up both the size of models and the amount of data, and we've gotten performance improvements. So just here's a schematic plot where this horizontal axis is the logarithm of the amount of data you train on. This vertical axis might be the error on a wide variety of tasks, and the error falls off as a power law with the amount of data with some exponent, negative a. But a can be often close to zero, which means these scaling laws are very shallow. So why are they so slow? Actually, the intuition is that if you have a large data set, what like let's say 2 billion data points, what are the chances that the next data point tells you anything new compared to the old data? The answer is quite low. So what that means is the data is quite redundant, which is the origin of these shallow scaling laws, right? But what if you could build a non-redundant data set where each data point is built to be different from all the others, right? Then we actually showed both in theory and experiment that you can bend these power laws down, sometimes even to exponentials, and you can get much better scaling. So I think there's a lot of work to do in constructing these non-redundant data sets. And interestingly, we used ideas from statistical physics to solve that problem. And these are some of the equations we used. There's lots more ways to get at data efficiency. I'll give you some examples from my work and my colleagues' work at Stanford. For example, brains didn't just come out in isolation, trained on a lot of data. They're the product of evolution, right? So we did these large scale simulations where we simultaneously evolved simulated robots and we did morphological evolution. So we'd, for example, have a genetic algorithm that explored the shape of the space of shapes of robots, like adding limbs and so forth. And what we showed is that just in a few generations of morphological evolution, where you would change the shape of the robots, um, they got better at control. So what was the fitness function? Once we got a new morphology through evolution, we put all the robots through a tournament where they competed in a whole variety of complicated tasks, and they learned these tasks through reinforcement learning. So over evolution, we have morphological change, and within a lifetime, we have reinforcement learning. And it turned out that the over generations, the robots evolved bodies that were easier to learn to control. In fact, they got faster at learning over they got faster at learning over evolutionary time. And this is an example of the Baldwin effect that had been long been conjectured by evolutionary biologists, where later generations can learn faster because of evolutionary advantages. So this was an interesting computational demonstration of the morphological Baldwin effect. Dan Yamins, my colleague next door, has worked on building in curiosity into agents to help them explore the environment in better ways. And such explorations can yield more powerful training data to more efficiently train RL agents. You can also imagine faster learning through cultural evolution, where Noah Goodman, my psychology colleague, um, looked at situations where agents would learn something and they could communicate information to the next generation of agents through a simple text box, like a certain strategy presented through language, and then that agent would then use that language and then learn again with that piece of language. So it's like each generation gets to read the books of the past generation and then build on it. So I think that's a very interesting direction. And self-taught reasoning also. We'll talk more about reasoning at the end. Okay, so but in general, like I just want to say how impoverished our paradigms for machine learning pre-training at least are, right? So imagine we taught our kids the same way we pre-train our LLMs, right? So I'd give my son like a random chunk of the internet and say, by the way, this is the next word. Another random chunk of the internet and say, by the way, this is the next word. Then it would take forever probably for our kids to learn, right? So we need to change the paradigms of machine learning into some kind of new science of machine teaching. Like, how do we actually teach our machines better? And I think there's a lot more work to do there. Okay, so energy efficiency. Right. So there's a huge discrepancy between the energy of brains and machines. So, for example, our brain, its power consumption is about 20 watts, right? And just for reference, our old incandescent light bulbs were about 100 watts. So we're kind of all dimmer than light bulbs in some sense. And then, but what about AI? Well, a large training run can cost 10 million watts. And then people are talking about building nuclear power plants to power a billion watt data centers, right? So brains and machines went in very different directions as far as energy consumption goes. What are the reasons for it? Um, oh, I don't have the slide. Okay, so I think, okay, so let's talk about the general reasons for this. There's a few reasons. I think the fault of machines in terms of their energy hungriness lies in the choice of digital computation itself, right? We decided to compute in our artificial systems using very fast and very reliable bit flips, right? At a gigahertz rate, we're flipping a whole bunch of bits, which involve a whole bunch of electrons moving around in transistor circuits, very, very fast, right? The laws of thermodynamics demand that every fast and reliable bit flip must cost energy, right? And that's why we spend a lot of energy. But biology went a very different direction. Every intermediate step is slow and unreliable. It seems like it makes a lot of failures. Its clock speed is like, tens of milliseconds, right? But in that slowness and unreliability might not be a bug, it might actually be a feature. It might be the essential reasons why the brain is so energy efficient. Every intermediate step is as slow and as unreliable as possible without making the final answer too bad. So biology doesn't rev its engine any more than it needs to, and that's why it achieves its energy reliability, or sorry, energy efficiency. So we've been looking at, for example, going back to the drawing board and asking in various settings, what are fundamental limits on the speed, accuracy, and energy of a computation? And we've derived results, for example, in this paper of the form like, let's say this is the power consumption or energy per unit time spent by, say, some chemical computer, and this is the error of that computer, right? Then there's going to be some Pareto frontier, right? Which is for any given power consumption level, this is the minimal achievable error. And in the space of all designable chemical computers, this is the allowed region and this is the forbidden region. For example, at a certain energy consumption, you can never get an error below the Pareto frontier. And so we've been able to derive this Pareto frontier for a basic chemical computer that does cellular sensing, which is something that every neuron needs to do. And we've been able to find the structure of the chemical computers that trace this Pareto frontier. Just to, okay, sorry, so I haven't, okay, anyways, sorry, I thought I had one more slide on that, but let me just make sure I have the right, yeah, I do have the right talk, okay. Okay, so another thing that's really cool that we can do, powered by what my experimental colleagues at Stanford can do, is they can actually record, for example, from the entire brain of a fly, right? So this is the entire fly brain, and they can record the activity of neurons across the entire fly brain as they fire, but they can also record energy consumption in the form of ATP hydrolysis rates. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the fundamental chemical fuel that powers almost all cellular reactions. One ATP is burned to create an ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and then another and more, and it burns some energy that can be used to power these reactions. So we can measure the rate of energy consumption. And so we found something really interesting is that when neural activity goes up, you might initially think that ATP concentration would go down because it's got to spend fuel to power that neural activity. But actually, we found just the opposite. When neural activity goes up in a certain area, or even within a neuron, ATP within that neuron goes up immediately and stays elevated for a certain amount of time, about 90 seconds. And it turns out that that's the autocorrelation time of neural activity in the fly's brain itself. So the interpretation of that is that the brain is a predictive energy allocation machine. It predicts where and when energy will be needed, and it overproduces energy to supply that predicted demand for just the right amount of time, right? So that's kind of interesting. So in addition to the brain being like a smart information processing circuit, it could also be a smart energy grid. There's also really cool work going on by my colleague Kwabena Bohannan, who works in dendritic intelligence at Stanford. He had a nice Nature paper here, where this raises a really cool connection between evolution and chip design. All right. So if you think about like the dominant energy cost in chips, it's communication, right? So you have a whole bunch of processing nodes, and they have to communicate with each other. So you have to shuttle signals around from node to node quite fast. And so the energy, if you have n nodes, the energy of communication grows as n squared, right? If you have roughly all-to-all connectivity. So the only way to reduce this energy cost is to make the wires shorter, right? If you're not willing to tolerate longer latencies or lower bit rates, so then you have to make the wires shorter. But if your chips are laid out in 2D, as most of our chips are, there's only so much room for making the wires shorter because your processing elements spread out over space. So you need to go to 3 dimensions, okay? But then you run into a power dissipation problem, right? In a 3D volume, the power consumption would be proportional to volume if done naively. But then the surface area for dissipating heat grows sublinearly with volume. So your chips will heat up. There isn't enough surface area to dissipate the heat that's produced in the volume, right? But the brain has done this, right? The brain has scaled over evolution in 3 dimensions. So how did the brain solve this? Well, it turns out it solved this using sparser spatiotemporal patterns, right? So as brains scale up, neurons fire less, right? So, and that's what we see here, actually. Here's a scaling law now, but now it's an evolutionary scaling law where the axes are completely different. This horizontal axis is the number of neurons in a brain, and this vertical axis is the energy consumption, right, or power consumption. And you can see, like across many orders of magnitude, from mice to squirrels to humans and monkeys, there's a linear relationship where power consumption is literally linearly proportional to the number of neurons, right? So it doesn't grow as a square of the number of neurons, as you might expect if communication cost dominated. So it turns out that the brain figured out a really nice scaling law to as brains get bigger, to not spend as much energy doing this. And the key idea is that as brains get bigger, each neuron fires at a slower rate. So then as you scale it up, energy consumption doesn't grow as the square of the number of neurons. It turns out that if you naively scaled a fly brain, fly isn't even here, but if you scaled it up, the same way we scale our chips, a fly brain would consume as much energy as a human. Right? Sorry, not if you scale up the fly brain, but like if you designed a fly brain the same way we designed our chips, the fly brain would consume as much energy as a human. Right? So if you're interested in more details, you can take a look at this paper. Okay, now going beyond evolution, what do I mean by that? Well, we don't have to be limited by the hardware that evolution chose. For example, we could replace our neurons with atoms, right? So just like neurons signal stuff through different, say, spikes that go from one neuron to another, electrical, impulses, you could replace the firing states of neurons with the electronic states of atoms, right? Maybe excited electronic states are like a neuron firing or so forth. And then you can replace synapses with photons that travel from atom to atom. So for example, as an atom changes its electronic state, it can emit a photon. That photon can travel to another atom and change its electronic state. So you have a network of interactions between atoms, which play the role of neurons, and photons, which play the role of synapses. Okay, so what can we build with that? So my colleagues can build very interesting devices that I help them analyze through theoretical analysis. So for example, here we worked on understanding a Bose-Einstein condensate where you have atoms sitting inside an optical cavity. Light is shining back and forth. That's connecting the atoms in a network, and the atomic spins are flipping as the light shines back and forth. It turns out the low energy effective dynamics of the system is like a Hopfield associative memory. This is the same Hopfield associative memory that John Hopfield won the Nobel Prize for in the recent Nobel Prize for Physics. But this time it's implemented in a quantum mechanical system. And it can actually store memories much more efficiently and much more accurately and with much higher capacity than the classical Hopfield model. And we can even drive the system into more quantum mechanical states where it can solve optimization problems by exploring entangled states among spins. So if you're interested in more details, you can look at these two papers. We can also look at other types of machines, a machine called the coherent Ising machine, which is a network of photons that can actually solve optimization problems, and we can understand its energy landscape. And I won't go into the details. There's too much to go into there, but you can look at this paper if you're interested. I think there's kind of an entirely new field that could open up called quantum neuromorphic computing, where you marry the algorithms of neural computation with the dynamics of quantum mechanical systems to get new types of algorithms that are not within the traditional gate-based framework for quantum computing. Okay, now going back to neuroscience, right? So the a trick is really understanding the brain, but also understanding AI. So we need more explainable models of both, right? So we can accelerate neuroscience discovery a lot this way. So the basic idea is you record large data sets from the brain through so-called brain observatory, and you try to build a digital twin of the brain. And then you use explainable AI to understand that twin, to extract testable predictions, to extract conceptual insights, and so forth. So what's an example of that? We did this on the retina. So my colleague, Steve Backus, and his students and postdocs can record neural activity from the retina, right? So we showed videos to a retina on a dish, and we recorded the ganglion cells that are the source of your optic nerve fiber. Each of you have 1 million ganglion cells that tell you in your retina that tell you everything you know about the visual world. So we recorded from them in a salamander retina, not a human. And so we had a data set of movies and neural recordings. So how do we understand the mapping from neural activity patterns to responses? What we did is we trained a convolutional neural network to predict the biological retina's neural responses from the movies. And we got a neural network that worked, that did really well, and it actually reproduced 2 decades worth of experiments on the retina. So that's fantastic, but how does it do that, right? We don't want to just say that our understanding of the retina is this one big model, right? So what we did is for each of the experiments that people had done on the retina, we were able to take that experiment and extract from this model through model reduction. We basically did some causal analysis to trace the flow of activity and information from input to output for any particular stimulus. We were able to find the subset of neurons that were most important for mediating the transformation from input to response. And we could carve out an important subcircuit that mediated the response to that particular stimulus. Then we would go back to the literature and look like, okay, what do experimentalists think is the best possible model for that simple experiment that they did? And we could compare our model to the best possible model in the literature, and we found that we were always got the same answer as what neuroscientists had gotten in the past. But then for the first time, we had one single model that could explain all of the experiments. Okay, so if you want more details there, you can look at this paper. But if we look at even more modern technology, my colleague Mark Schnitzer at Stanford can build these really amazing microscopes that can scan large areas of the cortex, say in mouse, for example, by simultaneously scanning 16 lasers across the brain. And moreover, he can build these robotic microscopes that so here's 4 robots, and each robot has at the end of it a microscope that can be inserted into a different brain region in the mouse. So you can record from multiple brain regions across the mouse brain while it's doing a complicated task. And so just to show you what the data looks like, here's an example of neural activity in the mouse's brain. Each of these dots is a neuron, and it gets brighter and dimmer. When it gets brighter, that means it's firing, right? So you can literally see the brain in action while the mouse is doing stuff, right? You can imagine that there's a lot of machine learning and high-dimensional data analysis that goes into just analyzing these data sets to figure out what the brain is telling us. So it's really remarkable. Okay, so what can we do with that? We can actually decode what the mouse is seeing. So So for example, we can show the mouse natural movies. That's what the mouse is seeing on the top, and we can decode from the neural activity recorded from the mouse's brain. We can reconstruct what the mouse is seeing. Now our reconstructions are lower resolution than the actual what the mouse is actually seeing, but that's partially because mouse visual acuity is low resolution itself. Okay. We're actually working on another project at Stanford called the Enigma Project with Andreas Toliash, where we're actually building digital twins, not only of the mouse brain, but the entire primate visual system. And we're going to try to use explainable AI to understand how it works. So that's ongoing work that we're quite excited about. So another aspect of explainable AI is like explaining what the heck AI systems are doing, right? Um, so something near and dear to my heart is diffusion models. So these diffusion models can generate really, really complicated images, right? Some of them look like they probably don't appear in their training data. They seem quite novel and creative. So where is this creativity coming from, right? That's a big puzzle. How is it composing these new images out of the training data? So recently made some progress on this, which I'll describe. So the main idea behind diffusion models, the first diffusion model was actually invented in my lab by Joshua Soldikstein. And we were thinking a lot about non-equilibrium statistical mechanics at the time. In particular, like ideas like Jarzynski's equality, where you can show that entropy can be transiently reduced over time in a stochastic process. And you can prove bounds on the probability of certain amounts of entropy reduction, actually equalities on various probabilities of entropy reduction. And all of those, the proofs behind all of those equalities involved looking at the log probability ratio of a forward trajectory and its corresponding time reverse trajectory. And Joshua had the brilliant idea that we can maximize this probability by not using the same physics for the time reverse trajectory, but just replace it with a neural network and train it to reverse the flow of time. And so it's literally non-equilibrium stat mech that led to this idea of diffusion model. So again, just without any of that motivation, just imagine a situation where you have some data and you have the data undergo diffusion. So each pixel undergoes diffusion until it gets destroyed into noise. Then you train a neural network to reverse this process. So it turns out if you can do it perfectly, and there are actually analytic formulas that allow you to do it perfectly, then it will work. But then what will happen is the noise will go back to the training set image, right? So it won't be creative. So the fundamental creativity of diffusion models lies in their failure to train to do what they're asked to do. So how can they fail in intelligent ways? We recently figured that out, and we were able to do the following, right? So just to explain what we're able to do, so imagine that here's a single piece of noise that you feed into a trained diffusion model, and then it spits out an image, which we'll call the experimental image that we're trying to explain. So this diffusion model has a lot of inductive biases in it. It's usually a convolutional U-net. So it has inductive biases, which means it's local, which means, okay, so the image goes in, and this is what's called the score function. It tells you which direction the image should flow in the reverse process. So the decision as to which direction a pixel should flow is local in the sense that it only depends on a local neighborhood. And two, it's equivariant. That decision rule is copied across the entire circuit because of, across the entire image because of weight sharing in the convolutional neural network. So what we did is we just wrote down, it turns out you can write down analytically the optimal machine that reverses diffusion subject to locality and equivariance constraints. And that gives us an analytic machine which you can interpret easily. So what this machine does is it takes an image and it reverses it back in time, but each pixel's decision depends only in a local neighborhood. So then this local patch can flow back to one training set patch from one image, but another local patch can flow back in time to a different training set patch from a different image. So at the end of the day, what gets created by this analytic differential equation is a local patch mosaic of the training data, where different parts of the image come from different images in the training data. Okay, so this is a completely interpretable ordinary differential equation. So then what we can do is we can say, does it actually predict or explain what the trained diffusion model does? So we can take the same noise realization that we fed to the trained diffusion model, and we can feed it to our analytic theory, and then we can get out a prediction. And then we can compare our theoretical prediction to the experiment. So how good is the comparison? It turns out, sorry, it turns out it's remarkably good. So here are examples of theory experiment comparisons. So each pair, the right-hand side is the experiment spit out by a trained diffusion model. The left-hand side is the theoretical prediction spit out by our theory when both the trained diffusion model and the theory get the same noise realization. So you can see there's a very nice match between theory and experiment across MNIST, CFAR10, and fashion MNIST. So we also have more recent results in Celebay. So we can't go to more complicated diffusion models that involve or more complicated data sets because they require more complicated diffusion models to accurately model them. And what's the complication that's required? You often need self-attention layers in the diffusion model, and our theory doesn't account for self-attention layers. It turns out it approximates what the self-attention enabled UNets do, but there are interesting differences that we still have to explain. So this theory is only for convolution-only diffusion models. Okay. So again, now going back to the brain, I think melding brains and machines is a really interesting direction. So, you can imagine a scenario where we can learn the language of the brain and then speak back to it. So what do I mean by that? So what we can do is we can record neural activity patterns of the brain, read from it, and build a digital twin of the brain that behaves in the same way as the brain in terms of stimulus response patterns. Then we might want to get the brain to do something. So how do we get the brain to do something specific? Well, if we have a digital twin, we can apply control theory to the digital twin to figure out what neural activity patterns we would inject into our digital twin in order to get the digital twin to do something. Then we can take those neural activity patterns and transfer it to the brain and see if the brain will then do the same thing. So we now have the technology, again, thanks to one of my collaborators, Carl Dijsselroth at Stanford, who invented optogenetics. It's a method for shining light into the brain and making neurons fire. And you can shine spatiotemporal patterns of light in the brain to create spatiotemporal patterns of neural activity firing. And you can control now like hundreds of neurons this way at millisecond time resolution. So we've been playing around with this kind of read-write approaches, and a very, very early result was that we could write in neural activity patterns into the mouse's brain so that it would perceive a certain simple image that we would like it to perceive. For example, an oriented grading like this. So yeah, we basically followed this paradigm in a very simple way, and we were successful. We could write in neural activity patterns, and the mouse would behave as if it saw the oriented grading. And so this got written up in the New York Times with this kind of headline, why are these mice hallucinating? Scientists are in their heads, so to speak. But this is the paper where you can get all the details for it. There's a very interesting direction where you could actually use brains to directly instruct machines, which I like to call biohybrid AI. So for example, classic AI is just this bottom row. You have input stimuli, you have desired outputs, you have a parameterized neural network, you train the neural network to predict desired outputs from given inputs. Right? But you could also have a brain solve the same tasks. You get this side loop, right? And you get neural activity patterns in the brain. You can imagine the neural network has to not only spit out the desired output, but spit out the neural activity pattern required by the brain to spit out the desired output. So you could use neural activity patterns to regularize you could use biological neural activity patterns to regularize an artificial neural network. So that's an interesting, I think, direction that people are starting to play with. So I think this kind of like melding of minds and machines is a really interesting direction to go in terms of both understanding the brain, curing the brain, and potentially even augmenting the brain. Okay, and then the
Excuse me,
last
sir.
thing. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. That is the energy efficiency the only reason why we are thinking about shifting to a digital twin, or are there any other reasons? Because there are bound to be other problems while shifting to a digital twin, right?
Oh, yeah, I wasn't actually thinking about. I mean, the digital twin will actually spend more energy than the brain, just because it's implemented in a digital computer. So sorry, I didn't mean to say that the twin is digital. The twin itself is often another neural network, right? So we think of it as an analog neural network with linear summation of inputs and then a long nonlinearity, but it just happens to be implemented in a digital computer. Yeah. So what we should really think of in this box is just an artificial neural network that mimics the biological neural network. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Um, okay, and the very last topic, I wanted to leave like time for questions and stuff, and I realize it's Friday night on Independence Day, so I'll end quickly. But the last topic is reasoning because it's such an important topic at the moment. Um, last year, Alpha Proof got a silver medal on the International Math Olympiad, and this year, both Google DeepMind and OpenAI, using a presumably different system that different from the one I'm about to talk about, got a gold medal on the IMO. So this is absolutely remarkable. And so what's going on in these systems, or more generally, AI systems that can now write proofs of mathematical theorems? So they're not, apart from the gold medal winning one, which we don't know much about, but they claim that they're not using extra tools above and beyond a language model. But in a lot of settings where we have proof systems, it's not just a language model anymore. You have a language model that's, for example, guessing the next step or tactic in a proof. Then you have a formal proof assistant verifier, say like a system using Lean or something like that, that uses a system like Lean that uses um, formalization of mathematical proofs. This proof assistant verifier can check whether the proof so far is logically correct and internally self-consistent. So then the proof assistant verifier returns whether or not that guess was valid. If it's valid, the language model can continue and guess the next step. If it's invalid, it could backtrack, it could restart, or whatever, right? So this is kind of like a search process where the composite system is going down a search tree of possible next steps. The LLM is guessing which branch to go down, and the proof assistant verifier is saying whether it can continue down the branch or not, right? So this is search essentially. If you zoom out in AI, there's really only two games in town. There's learning and there's search at a very high level, right? We've been working in the last decade scaling up learning, and now we're scaling up search in some sense. There's an analogy to a very, very high level, kind of loose analogy to the human brain. There's work by Kahneman, who wrote this famous book about fast and slow thinking. You could think roughly of the language model as our system one, or fast intuition, right? We often make really rapid, sometimes emotional, intuitive guesses as to what to do next. And then we have a system two, which is much more slow and deliberative deductive thought. You could think of the proof assistant verifier as that system. It's an interesting analogy. I don't know how much to make of it, but it's been made. So a new dimension of scaling is scaling up inference time compute via search. So for example, here's an example where this is, say, the number of times you are allowed to search the search tree. And this is your performance correct. And you get the scaling law where you get better and better the more you're allowed to search the search tree. Okay, that's great. But now that we have these two phases, the learning phase and the search phase, we can ask whether we're optimally co-designing them. And you might think that we're actually not, because if you think about the learning phase is training a large language model via single token prediction, right? So but the inference phase is taking multiple guesses along a search tree. So it turns out learning and inference are not co-designed well and therefore can be suboptimal. The reason is learning involves placing as much probability as possible on the most likely next steps as indicated by your training data. This is fantastic if all the probability is placed on correct steps, but it's not if a lot of probability is placed on incorrect steps. So that's the notion of being confident and wrong. You place a lot of probability on a certain next step, but it's the wrong next step, right? Search instead would like you to spread your probability across many promising next steps because you're allowed many, many guesses. So why not hedge your bets and place a low amount of probability on many, many things because you're not sure which one is correct or not? So you can see that they're totally misaligned in this sense. And learning can hurt search if learning and search are not aligned via co-design. For example, if you have a confident and wrong guesser, it doesn't matter how many times you allow it to guess, it'll never guess the right answer because it's always placing too much probability in wrong answers. Okay, so in this paper, we made some progress in solving this problem of better co-designing learning and search. And these are fantastic students in my lab, Feng Cheng and Alan Rantos. And this is the paper. So we proved a theorem, which stated informally is if your guesser has a certain accuracy constraint, and it's allowed n guesses at test time, or n times to search the tree, the optimal guessing policy obeys the following properties. If you're allowed only a small number of guesses during search, then the optimal learned guesser should confidently exploit with a low entropy guess distribution, i.e., it shouldn't hedge its bets because it's not allowed to guess that many times. So it should place most of its probability mass on what it thinks is the most likely correct answer. But if it's allowed more guesses during search, the optimal learned guesser should unconfidently explore with a high entropy guess distribution, i.e., it should spread its probability mass amongst many possible guesses. Okay, so we discovered an efficient algorithm that chooses the right amount of exploration for any amount of searches at test time. And then we actually got better performance. So here are the results. So we learned an 8 billion parameter language model on math with different levels of exploration. And then we tested it on math problems and mathematical theorem proving with different levels of search. So there's a lot going on in this figure, so let me unpack it. Okay, so this horizontal axis is n, the number of times you're allowed to guess while proving a theorem or coming up with solving a math problem. So this is the test time compute axis, right? This vertical axis is the probability of being correct, okay? This red curve is what everybody else does. This red curve is where you train the language model using cross-entropy loss, and you test it using different amounts of test time search. And you see you don't do that well, okay? These colored curves are new learning, the performance of new learning algorithms, and they have a hyperparameter, which is n prime. N prime tells the learning algorithm how many guesses you'll have at test time, and it modifies the learning algorithm to allow more exploration if n prime is bigger. And you can see that you get different performance levels for different amounts of n prime. And if you match the n prime in training to the n in testing, you can trace out this Pareto-optimal frontier, right? So what this tells you is that you should tune your learning algorithm during pre-training to match the amount of test time compute you'll have at test time, right? And if you do that, you'll always do the best, okay? And you'll do much better than what everybody else does. Okay, so that's that. And then I just want to summarize with some outlook, right? We're all in academia. We're not at frontier labs that have tons of resources. And so the progress. So what can we do? So the progress of AI has progressed kind of like by going drunk on resource consumption, right? More GPUs, larger models, more data. So we've gotten better and better performance by moving along this axis. And of course, we get better performance. We move up here like this. But of course, there's always a Pareto frontier, which is the best you can possibly do for a given amount of resources. And I don't think we spent enough time in this regime trying to push the current frontier upwards. And I think there's a lot that we can do there to do that. And the brain stands as an example of what we can achieve, right? The brain is 20 watts, 100 million tokens, right? Way less on the data and energy resources than AI. So I think there's a lot more that can be done here, and that's where we can contribute, I think, and it'll be incredibly impactful if we can push up the frontier here. So anyway, I encourage everybody to think about that. So again, I think there's lots of room for like a unified science of intelligence that spans both brains and machines, and that's what we love to work on. And we use ideas from a ton of disciplines. It's kind of you need a village to solve these kinds of problems because there's so many perspectives needed to solve what I think are some of the hardest and most interesting computational problems in the world. How does AI work, and how do brains work? All right, I'll stop here and take questions. Let me stop sharing, actually.
Thank you for a very nice talk, Professor Ganguli. I have some very naive questions. I do not work in AI.
Uh-huh.
One of them is what is attention in the context of neural networks? I have heard about attention, and you also use this word self-attention.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's a technical term. Um, so basically it's hard to explain it quickly, but at a very high level, when you have a large language model, that's where attention is used a lot. When you have a large language model, it needs to predict the next word from the previous words, right? And so different words have different levels of relevance in predicting the next word. So for example, what's a good example? The monkey ate a, right? And the next word is probably banana. So the two key words that are relevant for predicting banana are monkey and ate, right? The word a doesn't matter too much. So the neural network learns to allocate its attention or how much weight it places on different words to predict the next word. And so attention is a parameter in the AI context is a parameterized function that can be trained to allocate weights to different tokens. And that's how it's used in large language models. It can also be used in vision models as well, where one pixel pays attention to other pixels in deciding where it flows. And that's how it's used in diffusion models.
Mhm. And what would be self-attention in this context? Um,
Oh, yeah. So in this context, cross attention is where, um, let's say you have two neural networks that are doing different things. When one neural network is deciding to make decisions, it can pay attention to the activity patterns of the other neural network. That's cross attention. And then if you have one neural network, one part of the neural network can pay attention to another part of the same neural network, and that's self attention.
is it anything similar to we talking to ourselves in our minds when we?
Oh, interesting. Potentially. I mean, the brain is a big recurrent neural network, right? So everything is talking to everything else. And so, yeah, I mean, I think our internal monologue is definitely due to the reverberation of neural activity through a recurrent neural network.
Oh, another naive question that I had was you said that our the human brain uses around 100 million tokens to get to the performance level that we adults have. But you also noted that even the artificial neural networks, which train on, let's say, several trillions of data points, they have a lot of repetition, and I would think that even the 100 million things that the human brain learns, even that comes through a lot of repetition. If I include the repetition, will the two things match, or you still see there is a distinction between the amount of
Yeah.
data that the
I think it's still orders of magnitude because we're talking about like 10 trillion words versus
Mhm.
100 million words, right?
Uh-huh.
And it turns out on the internet, there's tons more duplication than we ever experience, right? Like,
Mhm.
how many times do we ever read the same passage twice, right? Um, but the same passage can occur many, many times on the internet. That's
Mhm.
why the scaling laws, I think, are so bad, is because there's so much redundancy on the internet.
Uh-huh. And one final question I had was, um, is the current hypothesis in the community that you work in that the human brain is completely classical, or you see scope for some quantum mechanical processes also relevant for
Yeah,
the human?
yeah, it's pretty classical. I think the issues are that it's operating at body temperature, right?
Mhm.
So there's very little room for quantum coherence to play an important role in neural computation. The
Mhm.
one place where it's remotely quantum mechanical are the first steps of vision. So there are these famous experiments that show that we can detect single photons, or our photoreceptors can detect single photons. And the
Mhm.
way you show that is you can dim a light so much that you can measure the number, that the number of photons coming out of that light is order of magnitude, say 5 to 10, right? So those 5 to 10 photons come to our retina, and the chances they all go to the same photoreceptor is virtually zero. That means individual photoreceptors are detecting individual photons, and that's changing the electronic states of rhodopsin, and that's a quantum mechanical effect.
Yeah.
But that's the closest to where quantum mechanics ever played a role in our brain.
Actually, I had come across two more examples where I felt there is scope for some quantum mechanical process to be relevant. One was apparently an isotope of lithium is prescribed
Yes.
to. You might be aware of this.
I've heard about that. Matthew Fisher is a big
Yeah.
proponent of that, right? I
Yeah.
had lunch with him and he explained it to me.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was many years ago when I had lunch with him. I did find that one to be somewhat interesting. And I think if I remember correctly, there was a nuclear spin or
Yeah.
something quite shielded in its electronic
Yeah.
environment.
Mhm.
And a reaction rate depended on whether the spin was up or down.
Yes.
And that could be modified by lithium. And that was
Yeah.
his explanation for why lithium can play a role in
Mhm.
helping with depression or manic
Yeah. Yeah.
bipolar disorders. That is interesting. I don't know what to make of that. Yeah, that's one where you can't immediately rule it out.
Mhm.
And the protection comes from the nuclear aspect of it, right?
Yes.
But I don't fully understand that chemistry, so I can't give a critical analysis of it.
But at the moment, I think the community is also not taking this observation seriously, or people are thinking about this, or is only Matthew
I
Fisher
think it's
thinking about this?
curiosity. It's a curiosity.
Mhm.
Matthew Fisher's the only one I've heard sort of really pushing this.
Okay. One more observation, which probably is very similar to this, is which I actually came across on a popular science video. It I do not remember which lab they visited, but they visited one of the labs in the US, and they said that the human brain, if you, they were trying to map the electric signals from different parts of the human brain, and this subject was sitting in a magnetic field which was of the order of Earth's magnetic field, pretty small, and they could show that the human brain was firing differently in different regions when the magnetic field was in a particular orientation or in some other orientation. So even that small magnetic field to get detected in a biological system at like our brain kind of suggests that there might be something quantum mechanical involved. Do you think that is a possibility, or?
Does it have to be quantum mechanical, or can it be just classical electromagnetism?
Yeah, at the moment, I am also not very clear about it, but I have heard another example where they say that birds use
Birds,
Earth's magnetic field to go
yeah.
very long distances. So there, they certainly have a quantum hypothesis for it. I do not know whether there is a competing classical hypothesis to explain this phenomena.
Yeah, I would just first do the classical E&M analysis, compute, to what extent can these magnetic fields bias the flow of charges in neurons, and see. Yeah, but I am aware of the birds detecting magnetic fields, but I've never looked into the details of how that works. It's a very interesting topic.
That's all from my side. If anyone else has any questions.
Hello, I'm audible, sir. There was recently a paper came out about the how LLMs are reasoning, and it showed that if a problem has only a few steps, like one or two steps, the reasoning models are able to do quite well, and they're able to come to the right answer pretty easily and in less number of steps. But when the problem has a lot of steps, like a lot of complex steps, then the normal models are able to do well, because LLMs that are reasoning, they are leaving out a few possibilities that the traditional model is able to get. So isn't it if we are making a model, like if we are training it for being a reasoning model, aren't we killing that search part of it that you mentioned? Because there was one more research paper which was
about LLMs working in a form of a tree, where we are going to like save a state at which the LLM is, and it's going to like rectify its path if it come at the wrong conclusion. So if we are going to like take reasoning models and that approach together, aren't we, like going to get the wrong conclusion most of the times?
The wrong so what is the conclusion that
I'm
is
asking like, how can we like make reasoning better in these cases, or is there like no way to like make the reasoning better?
yeah. I I feel like, and the right answer is I don't know, but I feel like from what I've seen, just LLM reasoning alone is it has all sorts of errors. It can't do very, very deep logical reasoning. In toy problems where you train it explicitly on reasoning traces, it can take shortcuts on long reasoning traces and so forth. I think the interaction with the proof assistant verifier or some formal reasoning checker can make it much more powerful, but it's still not complete. And then reinforcement learning using data generated from this interactive cycle. So people call that recursive self-improvement, where you the LLM generates its own data. You have some filter that selects the best data. That could be, say, a verifier or something like that. And then you retrain on that generated data and get this recursive self-improvement. I know a lot of people are excited about that, and that may have been an important step in winning the IMO gold without any tools, presumably. So I think there's just a lot of open questions in this domain. Um, but I think the recursive self-improvement is a very interesting direction. Like, I'd love to have better theory and when it works, when it doesn't, and so forth. Um, I don't know
Also,
if that
like
answers
as you
that question
mentioned,
specifically.
kind of also like as you mentioned, the system where we are going to like ask a assistant to review the output of an LM, can't that system like induce bias into the model, because people have bias, like most of them do, right?
Yeah,
So how can we reduce that? Like maybe we can use an approach where we are taking like multiple instances of that, like multiple assistants, but still like the whole crowd can even have the bias. So how
yeah,
can we like take care of that?
yeah. It's a good question. So that's why these things are working so well in formal areas like math and coding, where the checker, whether it's a proof assistant or a compiler, they have no bias. They just return whether or not the code will compile, whether the proof is correct. And so there's a gold standard response there. People are also building reward models where they try to predict how much reward any given LLM generation should get, and that's often trained using reinforced learning from human feedback or human inputs. And there, yes, of course, all the biases will fit in and will feed in. And I'm not sure we have a good way of dealing with that. I think as soon as you start learning from human values, you have to be careful about which values you're putting into the neural network. There is some work on building in a plurality of values. So, for example, my colleague Yejin Choi at Stanford is working on that. Michael Bernstein also is working on that, where, for example, there's all this psychological work done on different value systems that humans have, and you can try to come up with re-ranking algorithms for, say, social media recommendations, where you rank them according to different values, and you get completely different feeds that way. So, for example, I might want posts that make me happy or posts that make me angry, which is probably like what they're currently doing, or posts that are instructive or posts that give me wisdom or something like that. And if you want to learn more about that, check out Michael Bernstein's work at Stanford. He has some very nice work where he documents human values and he figures out ways to pick certain values to amplify in, say, social media feeds. I'm sure you can do that for LLM generations as well. Um,
Also, like, what's your view upon the new models that we have after LM? Like, we have Titans by Google, I think, and LCM by Meta, and these kind of architectures. What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion. I haven't looked in detail into those yet, so I'm not sure I have a strong opinion. I think it's great if there was something other than the transformer that we can play around with. Um, I think the state space models are kind of interesting because they're more recurrent. I mean, what I would love is for recurrent neural networks to really work, right? Because the brain has them. There is a connection, and there's an interesting connection between transformers and modern Hopfield models, and actually a connection between modern Hopfield models and astrocytes in the brain. So it turns out like the brain has neurons, but it also has astrocytes, and those astrocytes are these sort of helper cells that regulate plasticity between different neurons, and one astrocyte can connect to many different neurons. So Jean-Jacques Slotine from MIT had a recent paper in PNAS where he suggests that these astrocytes in the brain can implement the higher order interactions that are required for modern Hopfield networks and therefore transformers, right? So that's an interesting direction to think about. So I think there's lots of room for innovation in architecture, but the problem is that like Sarah Hooker, I think she's at Cohere now, she wrote about this thing called the hardware lottery. It's that the algorithms that win are the algorithms that can be implemented well in the current hardware, which is massively parallel GPUs at the moment with appropriate interconnects. So like, unfortunately, the hardware that we have to play with is determining the architecture to some extent, right? If you look at like the widths of layers in neural networks, they're often powers of 2. Why is that? Because like fast memory access often happens in lengths of units of powers of 2, and then if you do longer than that, it's longer to access the memory. So all of that is determining our architectures at the moment, which makes it harder to demonstrate the superior value of other architectures.
Okay, thank you so much. Also, you just said that like our brain acts like a RNN, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how can we be sure about that? Because like brain is quite complex in nature, and as you just mentioned, like other than neurons, there are other things as well. Maybe we are missing something out, and we're just
Yeah,
considering
no,
that it's an RNN.
yeah, so we know a lot about single neuron biophysics, and so we know that there are these neurons, they linearly summate their inputs, they could have some nonlinear dendritic processing. So this combination of linear, nonlinear, linear, nonlinear, and then they're recurrently connected, right? So it's hard to avoid that. I mean, it's all over the brain. And then these astrocytes are, of course, something new, but it's also cells that are, they're bodies and they connect to the synapses of other neurons, right? So just looking at the brain, there's only so much there, right? And the brain has to work with that. Now, what we don't understand are the nonlinearities in space and time as well, right? So they could be put together in interesting ways that we don't fully understand. But it's not like the transformer is very, very different, right? It's a completely feed-forward one-pass circuit. It's very different from the architecture of the brain. And we never were able to really get recurrent neural networks to train using backpropagation because of vanishing gradients and so forth and long distance dependencies. The reason transformers worked well is because it could connect long range dependencies across time with short computational paths through attention, right? The recurrent neural network connects long-range dependencies through time through very long computational paths through reverberation through the recurrent network. And we can never get that to learn very well. That's the problem.
Okay, also like what do you think when HI can come? As like we do have a graph for that and it says that can come around 5 years later. But as we are at like at current stage, I kind of feel like the LLMs are quite dumb right now. Because
Are
even
quite
though we
are quite what?
can I feel like LLMs are quite dumb in the sense that AGI won't be coming anytime soon because even though LLMs are able to solve PhD level problems, that is solely because the amount of data that has been given to them. If something
Yeah.
new comes out, LLMs can't really handle that
Yeah.
as well as a human
I,
brain can.
I tend to agree. I mean, see, we've never had a system that's read the entire internet and absorbed it in a somewhat useful way. And so that system can appear very smart to us. Um, but then we have to work really hard to expose its fragilities and really understand what it's doing. Like, so I think they're doing something very different from what the brain is doing. I think they are, like, they will deliver tons of economic value, right? But the way they'll deliver it is very different from the way that humans do it, right? We can take in very, very little data and come up with incredible new solutions. I feel like these LLMs are taking in lots and lots of data and impressing us by solving problems that are somehow close to their training set in some way, but we're impressed because we haven't seen the same data. And the really big problem is we can't analyze this scientifically because we don't have access to the training data. We don't know what they're trained on, right? So, but I'm optimistic that open source models will get better and better, and we will have access to the training data, and we can start to understand all of this, right? But these are the scientific questions we need to ask, right? How creative are these things really? How different of a problem can it solve than what's in its training data, really, right? And only once we have a scientific understanding of these questions can we rigorously assess whether or not we should be surprised by their capabilities.
Okay.
But
Because
that's
like
not to mean that
nowadays,
like these things aren't incredibly important for society, right? They will deliver economic value. They'll change the way we work. They'll change the way we do science and so forth. But it's different from humans.
I feel like it's gonna replace a lot of low-level jobs where a human can do like what 5 humans can do right now, because there won't be like a need to like do the low-level job, like low-level work as well. For example, a front-end engineer, like if someone who have like all the logic ready and he know every tech stack, I think he can work very well with LLM as compared to
Yeah,
someone who doesn't know much. Like if we give 5 people the same capabilities for LLM and one guy who has knowledge and give them an LLM, he's gonna like work way better, right? Also,
yeah, I think
nowadays it
so.
feels like models are just like benchmarking everything, because all the benchmarks we see that new models come and the responses are not that great. Like if we compare GPT-5 with GPT 4.0, the general public tends to say that it's not better, because
Yeah,
it does feel like that, because they even if they have worked on the math part, reasoning part, and coding part, I think that can be better, but it's not just being used by people like us, right? General public is using that as well, and they feel like it's not working well because they're just trying to like benchmarks everything. Like we have tests for maths, reasoning, but we don't really have any test for general public.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think there'll have to be new ideas above and beyond the way we scale learning and search. I think we'll need more ideas. I think like active learning, embodiment, exploration. I think those are things that are missing at the moment.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the insightful talk, sir. I had a question along the similar lines. There's a newer paper known as the hierarchical reasoning model, in
Uh,
which they actually have two time scales, a higher level and the lower level one. So I had a question how your work might relate to this, like from the perspective of your research on representation geometry and learning dynamics. How might such a two time scale architecture bias the way features emerge and organize in the network's representation space?
yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think that's an open research direction.
Yeah.
We're actually writing a grant at the moment on motor control with some really good roboticists, actually, Sergey Levine and Peter Abil at Berkeley, and a good vision person, Jitendra Malik, and a great experimental neuroscientist, Mark Schnitzer. So it's one of those grant calls in the U.S. from the Army where they ask for neuroscience inspired robotics, and the current systems that control robots are kind of end-to-end trained large neural networks that are homogeneous with no hierarchy of timescales, no modular, no modules, nothing. Like it's just one big neural network. But if you actually look at the motor control system of the brain, there's multiple modules, like a basal ganglia which does action selection on the timescale of hundreds of milliseconds, a cortex which orchestrates the basal ganglia over longer timescales, a cerebellum which does fine-tuned control of movement and so forth. So we're trying to come up with ideas for how, if you have a hierarchical system with an abstract slow system, and a fine scale, lower level, faster system, and then maybe an entire hierarchy. How do they communicate, and how should they learn, and how should they be hooked up? What should the more abstract slow system communicate to the finer fast system, and so forth? And we're going to use Mark Schnitzler's microscopes to record from multiple modules in a mouse brain while it's learning complicated tasks. And we're going to try to decipher the algorithms the mouse use and the principles, really, and then try to instantiate those principles in robots. And a really cool thing is, like, they now have a Mujoku model of a mouse. So we can do imitation learning to develop neural controllers for a Mujoku model of a mouse that mimics a real mouse, and then analyze those controllers, right? So there's lots of room for robotics and neuroscience to interact at this hierarchical time level of multiple time scales and abstraction scales. I think that's a fantastic direction to go.
Right. They also kind of use a deep RL approach by using Q learning, and so it is a very interesting space, I suppose. I also have another question on your recent paper, the alternating gradient flows. So I had an interaction with Dhruva, one of your co-authors, and I had a question like. Many results assume nice spectral structures like orthogonal inputs or clean Fourier modes. What happens if the input representation is highly non-orthogonal or exhibits strong mixing between modes? Like, would the predicted activation order still follow utility magnitude, or do you expect significant deviations from the normal?
Oh, I see. You're talking about the alternating gradient flows paper?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. The way we get a separation of timescales and a sequence of saddle points is to use roughly features of different amplitudes, right? So now if you have a bunch of features that are non-orthogonal, that's okay if they all have a similar scale, and then they'll all be learned simultaneously. But then the way you escape the saddle point is harder to analyze because you have multiple directions of escape. So you'd have to analyze a higher dimensional linear dynamical system. If you have a bunch of features that are not orthogonal, but they all have different scales, then they'll get learned at different times, and you're back to what we did in our paper, right? You'll have a sequence of saddles, and you'll escape each one using one unstable direction. And it doesn't matter so much that the features are non-orthogonal. That would be sort of a high-level expression. But, we'd have to look at the specific cases and analyze them. There might be other complications.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
So actually, I don't have a technical question. I just wanted to ask about your views on the tech research prospects in India. Like, considering you also talked about how you can improve the performance part rather than the resources part. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think India would be a great place to look at low resource improvement of low resource constraints, right? Like, I think one of the problems that these frontier companies have is that they have so much capital, and so they're just buying more GPUs and scaling up. But if you don't have GPUs, then necessity is the mother of invention in some sense, right? Like, you work with what you have, and you see what you can do at the low resource limits. And India has also been very good at theory, right? Like, string theory has been very good, right? India is a leader in that field. And I think theory of AI is something we need much more person power on, right? It's true that a lot of the glory goes to people who are scaling up and things like that. But I think the conceptual advances will come from people who are really thinking deeply about how these systems work and developing theories. So I think in terms of the theory of AI, I think India can play a huge role. Yeah, I visited India I was actually born in India, in Barakpur, outside of Kolkata. And I visited India a few times. I gave a talk at the Bose Institute in Kolkata, and the new institute in outside of Bangalore, the Institute for Theoretical Sciences, ITS. And there's fantastic people there. I mean, it's an incredible country. Like, I would love for India to rise even further up on the world stage and take its place. We have 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people, right? We should be able to do more. So I think working on the science and theory of AI is a fantastic opportunity for India.
Thank you.
So the questions are over. So we would like to end the talk now. So
Sure.
thank you for giving an insightful talk and taking out time and giving a wonderful talk.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for taking that time on a Friday night on Independence Day. I'm impressed that there's so many people here.
Thanks, sir.
Okay, great to chat with you all. All right. Okay, take care.